The Korthak homeworld of Vextar was a place where strength ruled everything. Their cities rose like jagged teeth from crimson soil, built from the bones of conquered worlds and the dreams of lesser species. For 3,000 years, no being had dared to look directly at warlord Thekvar without permission. He stood 9 feet tall, his obsidian carapace gleaming with bioluminescent war marks that told the story of 100 victories. His 4 arms each ended in claws capable of tearing through starship hulls, and his mandibles dripped with the venom that had ended the lives of countless challengers. The Korthak were apex predators in a galaxy full of sheep. They had conquered 17 star systems, enslaved 43 species, and turned entire worlds into hunting preserves for their amusement. Their society was built on a simple principle. The strong commanded, the weak obeyed, and those who forgot their place died screaming. Thekvar had earned his position as alpha through blood and brutality. He had killed his predecessor in ritual combat, then systematically eliminated every potential rival. For 2 decades, he had ruled the Korthak Empire with an iron fist wrapped in razor wire. His word was absolute law, his presence a source of terror that made hardened warriors tremble. The throne room where he held court was a monument to intimidation. The walls were lined with the skulls of defeated enemies, each one polished to a mirror shine. The floor was made from a single piece of black glass, smooth as ice and twice as cold. Massive columns supported a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of Korthak victories, showing their enemies fleeing in terror or dying in agony. At the center of it all sat the throne of dominion, carved from the fossilized remains of an extinct species and inlaid with gems that had once been the eyes of fallen kings. When Thekvar entered his throne room each morning, every being present would immediately drop to their knees and press their faces to the floor. The silence that followed was absolute. No one spoke unless spoken to, no one moved without permission, and absolutely no one met his gaze. This was the natural order. This was how things had always been. The day that changed everything began like any other. Thekvar strode into his throne room, his heavy footsteps echoing like thunder. The assembled courtiers, generals, and slaves dropped to the floor as one, their bodies trembling with the proper mixture of fear and respect. He took his place on the throne and began the daily ritual of receiving reports from his subordinates. Trade routes were secure. Rebellions had been crushed. New slaves had been acquired. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The empire was strong, and he was its undisputed master. Then the doors burst open. A squad of Korthak guards marched in, their weapons drawn and their eyes wide with barely controlled fury. Between them walked something that didn't belong in this room, this palace, or this world. It was small, perhaps 6 feet in height, with pale pink skin and an absurdly fragile-looking frame. Its limbs were thin as reeds, its body soft and unarmored, its face smooth and unmarked by battle scars. It was human. Thekvar had heard of humans, of course. They were a young species from a backwater world called Earth, barely worthy of notice. According to the reports, they were weak, slow, and utterly unremarkable. They had no natural weapons, no armor, no significant technology. They were prey animals who had somehow managed to stumble into space travel, probably by accident. Some Korthak scouts had encountered them recently during a routine patrol, capturing a few specimens for study. This must be one of those specimens. The human was male, dressed in simple gray clothing that looked more like a uniform than the rags typically worn by slaves. His hair was dark brown, cut short in a military style. His eyes were an unusual blue-green color like the surface of a calm ocean. He moved with a strange, fluid grace that reminded Thekvar of a predator stalking prey. Though that was obviously impossible. Humans were herbivores, after all. "My lord," grunted Captain Vextalk, the largest of the guards. "We found this creature wandering the lower levels. It claims to be an ambassador." Thekvar's mandibles clicked with amusement. An ambassador? This pathetic little thing? The very idea was laughable. Still, it might provide some entertainment. He had been feeling bored lately, and it had been some time since he'd had a proper execution. "Release it," he commanded. The guards stepped back, though they kept their weapons ready. The human stumbled slightly as the restraints were removed, then straightened up and looked around the throne room with obvious curiosity. His gaze swept across the skull-lined walls, the terrified courtiers, and the massive throne itself. When his eyes finally settled on Thekvar, something unexpected happened. He didn't look away. A murmur of shock rippled through the assembled court. Several Korthak warriors reflexively reached for their weapons, while others backed away as if witnessing something obscene. The slaves pressed their faces even harder against the floor, as if trying to become one with the black glass. But the human just stood there, looking directly at Thekvar with those strange blue-green eyes, completely unafraid. Thekvar felt a flash of anger at the creature's impudence. Did it not understand the proper protocols? Was it too stupid to recognize a superior being when it saw one? He would have to educate it before he killed it. "You will kneel," Thekvar growled, his voice echoing through the chamber like an avalanche. The human tilted his head slightly, as if considering the command. Then he shook his head. "No," he said simply. The word hung in the air like a physical thing. No one had ever said no to Thekvar. Not once in his entire reign. The concept was so alien, so unthinkable, that for a moment he couldn't process what he'd heard. "What did you say?" he whispered. The human's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked slightly bored. "I said no. I don't kneel to anyone." Captain Vextalk snarled and raised his weapon, but Thekvar held up a hand to stop him. This was becoming interesting. The creature was clearly insane, but there was something about its behavior that intrigued him. It showed no fear, no submission, no recognition of its place in the natural order. It was like watching a mouse try to intimidate a lion. "Do you know who I am?" Thekvar asked, rising from his throne. His full height was truly impressive, and the bioluminescent war marks on his carapace flared brighter, casting shifting patterns of light across the room. "You're Thekvar," the human said, pronouncing the name with casual ease. "Warlord of the Korthak Empire, conqueror of 17 systems, self-proclaimed alpha of this region of space." Self-proclaimed? The words came out as a roar that shook dust from the ceiling. "I earned this title through strength and blood. I am the apex predator of this galaxy." The human's mouth curved upward in what looked like a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Sure you are." The dismissive tone hit Thekvar like a physical blow. This creature, this insignificant speck of meat and bone, was mocking him. In his own throne room. In front of his own subjects. "You will show respect," he snarled, descending from the throne in 3 massive strides. "You will grovel and beg for mercy, or I will tear you apart slowly." The human didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "Or what?" he asked quietly. Thekvar stopped directly in front of the human, towering over him like a mountain of living death. His claws extended with audible clicks, each one as sharp as a sword and twice as deadly. Venom dripped from his mandibles, hissing as it hit the floor. The very air around him seemed to vibrate with barely contained violence. Any sane being would have collapsed in terror by now. This human should have been a quivering mass of flesh, begging for a quick death. Instead, he just stood there looking up at Thekvar with those impossible blue-green eyes, completely calm and utterly unimpressed. "You think you can intimidate me?" the human said, his voice so soft that only Thekvar could hear it. "You think I'm afraid of you?" "Every living thing fears me," Thekvar whispered back, his voice like grinding stone. "I am death incarnate. I am the nightmare that haunts the dreams of entire species." The human's smile widened, and for the first time, Tekvar noticed something unsettling about his eyes. They weren't the eyes of prey. They weren't even the eyes of a predator. They were something else entirely, something ancient and patient and utterly without mercy. "You want me to be afraid?" the human asked, taking a half-step closer. "You want me to kneel and grovel and beg?" "Yes," Tekvar hissed. The human's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow every word was crystal clear. "Make me." The challenge hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. Around the throne room, the assembled court held its collective breath. Some of the more sensitive species had already fainted from the sheer psychic pressure of the confrontation. Even the Korthak guards were backing away, their training warring with their instinct to flee. But Tekvar barely noticed them. All of his attention was focused on the small, soft creature standing before him, the being who had just done the unthinkable. Not only had it refused to submit, it had actively challenged him. It had invited him to try to force compliance. It had essentially declared war. For a moment that stretched like eternity, neither being moved. Tekvar's 4 arms twitched with the urge to strike, to rend and tear and destroy this impudent little creature. But something held him back. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the growing realization that this was no ordinary encounter. Or perhaps it was the first stirring of something he hadn't felt in decades. Uncertainty. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said finally. The human's smile turned into something that might have been mistaken for warmth, if not for the complete absence of emotion in his eyes. "Oh, I know exactly what I've done. The question is, do you?" Before Tekvar could respond, the human turned and walked away. Not hurriedly, not fearfully, but with the casual confidence of someone leaving after a pleasant conversation. He passed between the stunned guards, who made no move to stop him, and headed for the massive doors at the far end of the throne room. As he reached the threshold, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "When you're ready to have a real conversation," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, "you know where to find me." Then he was gone, leaving behind a throne room full of shocked silence and one very confused warlord. Tekvar stood frozen for several long moments, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. In his entire life, no being had ever challenged his authority so directly. No one had ever walked away from him without permission. No one had ever treated him like anything less than the supreme predator he was. And yet this human had done all of those things, as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. "My lord," Captain Vextalk ventured, his voice uncertain. "Should we pursue the creature?" Tekvar didn't answer immediately. He was still staring at the doorway where the human had disappeared, his claws extending and retracting unconsciously. The bioluminescent patterns on his carapace shifted through a complex series of colors reflecting his inner turmoil. Finally he spoke. "No, let it go." "But my lord, it showed you disrespect." "I said, let it go." Tekvar's roar silenced the captain immediately. The rest of the court cowered even lower, if such a thing were possible. But even as he gave the order, Tekvar knew this wasn't over. The human had issued a challenge, and challenges could not go unanswered. Not in Korthak society, not if he wanted to maintain his position as alpha. The question was, what exactly was he dealing with? The creature looked harmless enough, but appearances could be deceiving. There had been something in its eyes, something that spoke of hidden depths and dangerous currents. It had faced down a Korthak warlord without flinching, had issued a direct challenge without fear of the consequences. Either it was completely insane, or it knew something that Tekvar didn't. As the throne room slowly returned to normal and the business of empire resumed, Tekvar found himself thinking about those blue-green eyes and that casual, confident smile. The human had said they could have a real conversation when he was ready. Ready for what, exactly? The warlord settled back onto his throne, but for the first time in years, he felt uneasy. The natural order had been challenged. His authority had been questioned, and somewhere in his palace, a small, soft creature was waiting patiently for him to make the next move. The game had begun, though Tekvar wasn't sure he understood the rules yet. All he knew was that everything had changed the moment a human had met his gaze and whispered two words that no one had ever dared to speak. "Make me." 3 days passed before Tekvar saw the human again. 3 days of restless pacing, of snapping at subordinates, of staring at intelligence reports that told him nothing useful about this strange creature that had walked into his throne room and casually shattered every rule of proper conduct. The human's name was Marcus Chen, according to the files. Age 32, former military officer from something called the Earth Defense Corps. No known family, no significant possessions, no obvious weaknesses. The psychological profile was frustratingly vague, filled with terms like exceptional stress tolerance and unusual command presence that meant nothing to Korthak analysts. What troubled Tekvar most was the complete absence of fear in the creature's behavior. Every species they had encountered showed proper submission when faced with Korthak superiority. Even other predator races recognized the natural hierarchy and yielded to their betters. But this human acted as if the entire concept of dominance was foreign to him. The reports from the guards who had captured him were equally puzzling. According to them, Marcus had been found in a restricted section of the palace, apparently studying the architectural plans displayed on a wall monitor. When confronted, he had calmly identified himself and requested to speak with the warlord. No resistance, no attempt to flee, no visible weapons, just a polite request, as if he were applying for a job. The security footage was even more disturbing. It showed Marcus walking through the palace corridors with the confidence of someone who belonged there. He paused occasionally to examine wall decorations or peer through doorways, like a tourist taking in the sights. When guards approached, he waited patiently for them to escort him, never showing the slightest sign of distress. It was the behavior of someone who was exactly where he wanted to be. On the third night, Tekvar decided he had waited long enough. The human wanted a conversation? Fine. But it would be on Korthak terms, in a place of the warlord's choosing, under circumstances that would finally force the creature to acknowledge the reality of his situation. The palace dungeons were a testament to Korthak ingenuity when it came to breaking spirits. The cells were too small to stand in comfortably, too cold to sleep peacefully, and filled with the constant sound of dripping water that could drive even strong minds to madness. The walls were lined with hooks and chains that had held countless prisoners over the years, and the floor was permanently stained with substances that were best not examined too closely. This was where Tekvar had the human brought. Marcus was dragged from his guest quarters by 6 guards, though dragged was perhaps the wrong word. He walked calmly between his escorts, still wearing that same gray uniform, still moving with that same fluid grace. When they shoved him into the cell, he examined his surroundings with mild interest, like an architect evaluating a building's construction. "Functional," he said, running his fingers along the rough stone wall. "Not particularly imaginative, but it gets the job done." Tekvar stepped into view outside the cell, his massive frame filling the corridor. The bioluminescent patterns on his carapace pulsed slowly in the dim light, casting shifting shadows across his face. Behind him stood his personal guard, 12 of the largest and most brutal Korthak warriors in the Empire. "Now we speak on my terms," he growled. Marcus looked at him through the bars, and once again Tekvar was struck by the complete absence of fear in those blue-green eyes. If anything, the human looked amused. "You think putting me in a cage changes something?" Marcus asked. "It reminds you of your place in the natural order," Tekvar replied. "You are prey. I am predator. This is how things have always been, and how they will always be." Marcus laughed. It was a soft, genuine sound that echoed strangely in the confines of the dungeon. "You still don't get it, do you?" "Explain it to me." The human settled himself comfortably on the narrow stone bench that served as the cell's only furniture. Despite the damp cold and the oppressive atmosphere, he looked completely at ease. "You keep talking about natural order, about predators and prey, but you're looking at it all wrong." "Am I?" "You think strength is about claws and teeth and venom," Marcus said, gesturing at Tekvar's imposing form. "You think it's about who can tear through armor or who can roar the loudest or who can intimidate the most people. That's not strength. That's just biology." Tekvar's mandibles clicked impatiently. "What would a prey species know about strength?" "More than you might think." Marcus leaned forward slightly, and something in his posture changed. The casual friendliness remained, but underneath it was something else, something that made Tekvar's warrior instincts suddenly scream warnings. "Tell me, warlord, how many species have you conquered?" 43. "And how many of them fought back effectively?" The question was unexpected. Tekvar frowned, trying to understand where this conversation was leading. "A few. Most recognized the futility of resistance. The ones that fought back, what happened to them? They were destroyed. Their worlds turned to glass, their populations enslaved or eliminated." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "And the ones that surrendered immediately?" "They were incorporated into the Empire as servant races. Same basic outcome, though. Either way, they ended up under your boot." Marcus leaned back against the wall, his expression thoughtful. "You know what the difference is between your empire and mine?" Tekvar blinked. "Empire? What empire?" The intelligence reports had said nothing about humans controlling anything beyond their single homeworld. "You don't have an empire," he said slowly. "Don't I?" Marcus smiled that unsettling smile again. "How many worlds do you think humanity controls, Tekvar?" "One. Your homeworld." "Try again." Something cold began to form in Tekvar's stomach. The human's tone was too confident, too certain. "The reports said—" "Your reports are 3 months old," Marcus interrupted. "A lot can happen in 3 months, especially when you're dealing with humans." The warlord activated his personal communicator, connecting him directly to the intelligence division. "Admiral Kextoth, I need updated information on human territorial holdings. Immediately." There was a pause. Then the Admiral's voice crackled through the speaker. "My lord, we've been trying to reach you about this. The situation has developed." "What situation?" "As of this morning, human forces control 47 star systems. They've established colonies on over 200 worlds and have trade agreements with 63 species. Their expansion rate is unlike anything we've ever seen." Tekvar stared at Marcus, who was still sitting calmly on his bench, looking like he was enjoying a pleasant conversation over drinks. "That's impossible. 3 months ago, they barely had interstellar capability. We believe they may have had more advanced technology than initially reported," the Admiral continued. "Their ships appear from nowhere, their weapons are remarkably effective, and their diplomatic teams have been signing treaties faster than we can track them." "Signing treaties," Marcus said softly, just loud enough for Tekvar to hear. "Not conquest, not enslavement, treaties." Tekvar cut the communication and stepped closer to the bars. "What are you?" "I'm an ambassador," Marcus said simply, "which is exactly what I told your people when they captured me. Ambassadors don't walk into enemy palaces unannounced. Enemy? Marcus raised an eyebrow. I wasn't aware we were enemies. As far as I know, the Korthak Empire and the Human Cooperative have never been at war. You challenged me. In my own throne room. I corrected a misconception. The human's voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it now. You assumed I would kneel because that's what everyone else does. You assumed I was afraid because that's how your other subjects behave. You assumed I was weak because I don't have claws or armor or venom. Those were your assumptions, not my declarations of war. Tekvar's claws extended involuntarily. You said, make me. That was a challenge. No, Marcus said quietly. That was a statement of fact. You wanted me to kneel. I told you I wouldn't. You threatened to force me to do it anyway. I simply pointed out that you could try. I could kill you where you sit. You could try that too. Marcus's expression didn't change. But you won't. And why is that? Because you're smarter than you pretend to be. The human stood up and walked to the bars, close enough that Tekvar could have reached through and grabbed him. But he didn't step back, didn't flinch, didn't show any recognition of the danger. You've spent the last 3 days thinking about our encounter, trying to figure out what you're dealing with, wondering why a prey species would act like an apex predator. Tekvar said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. You want to know the difference between Korthak strength and human strength? Marcus asked. Your strength is physical. It's immediate and obvious and intimidating. But it's also finite. You can only be in one place at a time. You can only fight so many enemies at once. And eventually, you get old, and someone younger and stronger comes along to challenge you. I have never been defeated. Because no one has ever really tried. They've been too afraid. Marcus gripped the bars with his soft, unarmored hands. Human strength isn't about biology. It's about something much more dangerous. Which is? We don't know how to quit. The words were spoken softly, almost conversationally, but they hit Tekvar like a physical blow. There was something in the human's voice, something that spoke of absolute conviction and unshakable will. Your empire spans 17 systems, Marcus continued. Impressive. It took you 3,000 years to build it. We've matched your territorial holdings in 3 months, and we're just getting started. Through conquest? Through cooperation. Through trade agreements and mutual defense pacts and technological exchanges. Through making friends instead of enemies. Marcus's smile turned genuinely warm for the first time. Turns out, when you treat people as equals instead of subjects, they're a lot more willing to work with you. Tekvar's mind raced. The implications of what the human was saying were staggering. An empire built on cooperation rather than domination? It sounded like fantasy, but the intelligence reports suggested it was reality. You're lying. Am I? Your own admiral just confirmed it. 47 systems and growing. And we did it without firing a shot in anger, without enslaving anyone, without turning a single world into glass. Marcus leaned closer to the bars. We did it by being strong enough to choose a different way. Weakness masked as virtue, Tekvar snarled. Is it? Let me ask you something, Warlord. If I walked out of this cell right now, if I left this palace and this world and never came back, what would happen to your empire? The question caught Tekvar off guard. It would continue. For how long? You rule through fear and intimidation. Your subjects obey because they're afraid of what you'll do to them if they don't. But fear only works as long as you're there to enforce it. What happens when you die? What happens when someone stronger comes along? What happens when your people realize they outnumber you by billions to one? Tekvar had no answer for that. It was a question he had never allowed himself to consider. My empire doesn't depend on me. Marcus said quietly. If I died tomorrow, it would keep growing, keep expanding, keep bringing new species into the fold. Because it's not built on fear. It's built on something much more powerful. Which is? Hope. The word hung in the air between them like a foreign concept. In Korthak society, hope was weakness. Hope was what prey felt when they prayed for rescue that would never come. Hope was the emotion of the defeated. But the way Marcus said it, it sounded like something else entirely. Hope, the human repeated. The belief that tomorrow can be better than today. The faith that cooperation is stronger than domination. The knowledge that strength isn't about what you can destroy, but about what you can build. Thekvar stepped back from the cell, his mind reeling. Everything the creature was saying went against thousands of years of Korthak philosophy, against the very foundation of their society. And yet, "You're still in my dungeon," he said finally. Marcus laughed again, that same soft, genuine sound. "Am I? Look again." Confused, Thekvar examined the cell more carefully. The lock was still secure. The bars were still solid. The walls were still intact. But something felt different. Something fundamental had changed, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. "I'm physically in your dungeon," Marcus said, as if reading his thoughts. "But mentally, emotionally, spiritually, I'm exactly where I choose to be. And that's the difference between us, Thekvar. You can put my body in a cage, but you can't cage what makes me human." The warlord stared at the small, soft creature sitting calmly in his most intimidating cell, and for the first time in his life, he began to understand that he might be facing something truly dangerous. Not dangerous because of claws or teeth or venom. Dangerous because it couldn't be broken. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Marcus stood up and walked back to the bars, his blue-green eyes meeting Thekvar's gaze directly. "I want you to choose." "Choose what?" "Whether you want to keep being a predator in a galaxy that's evolving past the need for predators," Marcus said softly, "or whether you want to learn what it means to be strong enough to be something more." Before Thekvar could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the palace. His personal communicator crackled to life, Admiral Kextoth's voice tight with urgency. "My lord, we have a situation. A human fleet has just materialized at the edge of our system. They're requesting permission to dock and retrieve their ambassador." Thekvar looked at Marcus, who was still smiling that calm, knowing smile. "Fleet?" the warlord asked. 12 ships, the admiral reported. "Their technology is unusual. They appeared without triggering our sensors, and our weapons can't achieve target lock. They're just sitting there waiting." "Waiting for what?" Marcus cleared his throat politely. "Waiting for your answer to my question." The choice was laid out before him like a chess move. He could refuse to release the human, could try to use him as a bargaining chip or a hostage. But something told him that would be a mistake of monumental proportions. There was something about the way Marcus spoke, the casual confidence in his voice, that suggested he already knew how this would end. "And if I choose to keep being a predator?" Thekvar asked. Marcus's expression grew sad, almost pitying. "Then you'll discover that there are bigger predators in the galaxy than you ever imagined." The threat was delivered so softly, so gently, that it took a moment for the full implications to sink in. When they did, Thekvar felt something he had never experienced before: fear. Not the healthy respect for a dangerous opponent that he felt when facing other predators. Not the caution that came from recognizing a potential threat. This was something deeper, more primal. The fear of realizing that the rules of the game had changed while he wasn't looking, and he was no longer sure he knew how to play. The human was still sitting in his cell, still physically at his mercy. But Thekvar was beginning to understand that the bars were an illusion, that perhaps they always had been. "What happens if I let you go?" he asked. Then we have that real conversation I mentioned, Marcus said simply. And you learn what it's like to have friends instead of subjects. The communicator crackled again. My lord, the human fleet is asking for a response. What are your orders? Thekvar stared at Marcus for a long moment, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a prey animal or a curiosity or even an enemy, but as something he had never encountered before. An equal. Open the cell, he said quietly. The cell door swung open with a rusty creak that echoed through the dungeon like the sound of old chains breaking. Marcus stepped out calmly, brushing imaginary dust from his gray uniform, as if he had just finished a pleasant meeting rather than spending 3 days in a Korthak prison cell. Thank you, he said simply, and somehow managed to make it sound like he meant it. Thekvar's guards tensed, their weapons half drawn, waiting for orders. But their leader remained motionless, staring at the human who had just walked past him as if the entire conversation had been a normal diplomatic exchange. My lord? Captain Vextalk ventured uncertainly. Stand down, Thekvar commanded, his voice distant. Escort our guest to the communications center. The word guest sent ripples of confusion through the assembled warriors. Just moments before, this creature had been a prisoner. Now he was receiving an honor typically reserved for visiting dignitaries from allied species. The Korthak warriors exchanged bewildered glances. But they followed orders, forming a loose escort around Marcus as he walked through the palace corridors. The journey to the communications center passed in surreal silence. Marcus moved with the same casual confidence he had shown from the beginning, occasionally pausing to examine a piece of artwork or architectural detail. To any observer, he looked like a tourist being given a guided tour of the palace rather than a prisoner being transferred under armed guard. The communications center was a vast chamber lined with screens and holographic projectors, its curved walls displaying real-time images from across the Korthak Empire. At the center of the room stood a raised platform surrounded by banks of equipment that could reach any point in known space. Admiral Kextoth was waiting for them, his 4 arms moving frantically across multiple control panels as he tried to make sense of the sensor readings. When he saw Thekvar entering with the human walking freely beside him, his mandibles clicked in confusion. My lord, the human fleet is waiting for my response, Thekvar finished. Show me. The main display flickered to life, revealing a view of Korthak space that defied every assumption about human capabilities. 12 ships hung motionless at the edge of the system, but they looked nothing like the crude vessels described in the intelligence reports. These ships were elegant, streamlined works of art that seemed to bend light around them. They cast no shadows, reflected no starlight, and appeared to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty that made them difficult to focus on directly. How long have they been there? Thekvar asked. They appeared 37 minutes ago, the Admiral replied. No engine signatures, no displacement wake, no gravitational distortion. They were simply not there one moment and there the next. Marcus walked up to the display, studying the images with professional interest. The Harmony class, he said thoughtfully. Beautiful ships. Captain Williams always did have an eye for aesthetics. You know their commander? Thekvar asked. Sarah Williams, captain of the starship Endurance. We served together in the Centauri campaigns. Marcus's expression grew warm with memory. She's good people, patient, diplomatic, but absolutely ruthless when she needs to be. Admiral Kextoth's tentacles writhed nervously. Our weapon systems cannot achieve target lock. Their energy signatures are unlike anything in our databases. That's because you're looking at it wrong, Marcus said, walking over to one of the sensor stations. Without asking permission, he began adjusting the controls with practiced efficiency. Your sensors are calibrated to detect conventional energy sources. Human technology works on different principles. The display shifted, and suddenly the human ships became clearly visible. But what the new readings revealed was even more disturbing than their invisibility had been. Each vessel was massive, easily dwarfing the largest Korthak dreadnoughts, and their energy output was orders of magnitude beyond anything in the Empire's arsenal. "Impossible," Admiral Kextoth whispered. "Ships that size should require massive fusion cores, antimatter containment systems, millions of tons of reaction mass." "They do," Marcus said mildly. "Just not the way you think." He touched another control, and additional data streams appeared on the screens. But instead of clarifying the situation, they only made it more mysterious. The ships appeared to be drawing energy from vacuum fluctuations, manipulating space-time itself to achieve propulsion, and somehow maintaining perfect environmental stability without any detectable life support systems. "Zero-point energy extraction," Marcus explained, noting their confused expressions. "Alcubierre-style space warping, quantum-coherent life support matrices, standard human technology." "Standard?" Tekvar's voice was barely a whisper. "Well, for our Navy anyway. Civilian ships use simpler systems." Marcus turned away from the displays to face the assembled Korthak officers. "The thing you have to understand about humans is that we don't see problems the way other species do. When we encounter an obstacle, our first instinct isn't to go around it or submit to it. We try to understand it, and then we figure out how to make it work for us." He gestured at the images on the screen. "When our scientists discovered that space-time could be manipulated, they didn't just use it for faster-than-light travel. They figured out how to extract unlimited energy from quantum fluctuations, how to create perfectly stable environmental systems, how to build ships that exist partially outside normal space-time." Admiral Kextoth stared at the readings, his mind struggling to process the implications. "Such technology would take thousands of years to develop." "For most species, yes," Marcus agreed. "But humans don't develop technology linearly. We share everything freely, build on each other's discoveries, and refuse to accept that anything is impossible. What would take one species millennia to achieve in isolation, we can accomplish in decades through cooperation." The communication panel chimed softly, and a voice spoke in accented but clear Korthak. "This is Captain Williams of the cooperative vessel Endurance. Warlord Tekvar, we are requesting the immediate release of Ambassador Chen. Please respond." The voice was female, calm, and utterly professional. But underneath the diplomatic courtesy, there was something else. Not a threat, exactly, but a certainty that suggested the speaker was used to getting what she asked for. Tekvar looked at Marcus, who shrugged casually. "Your choice. You can tell her I'm fine and we're having a productive conversation, or you can refuse to release me and see what happens next." "What would happen if I refused?" Marcus's expression grew thoughtful. "Well, Sarah's not the violent type. She'd probably try economic pressure first. Cut off trade routes, establish competing commercial networks, that sort of thing. If that didn't work, she might escalate to more direct measures." "Such as?" "Oh, she'd probably park those ships in orbit around your core worlds and wait. Human ships can maintain position indefinitely without refueling or resupply. Our crews don't age normally when they're in quantum-suspended animation, so time isn't really a factor. She could wait decades if necessary." The casual way he described an indefinite blockade of the Korthak Empire's most important worlds sent chills down Tekvar's spine. "That would be an act of war." "Would it?" "She wouldn't be attacking anything, just occupying space. Technically, that's not illegal under most interstellar treaties." Marcus's smile turned slightly predatory. "Of course. Having 12 invisible, invulnerable ships hanging over your major population centers might make trade negotiations a bit difficult. Other species tend to get nervous about visiting systems under blockade." The implications were staggering. The Korthak Empire's economy depended on tribute and trade from conquered worlds. If other species became reluctant to do business with them, the entire system would collapse within months. "You would destroy an entire civilization over one person?" Admiral Kekstoth asked. "We wouldn't destroy anything," Marcus replied calmly. "We'd just make it clear that we don't abandon our people. Ever. Other species find that reassuring. It makes them more willing to work with us, knowing that we'll honor our commitments." Tekvar walked to the communication console, his claws clicking against the metal as he considered his options. He could try to fight, but the human ships were clearly superior to anything in his fleet. He could try to negotiate, but that would mean admitting weakness in front of his subordinates. Or he could do something that went against every instinct he possessed. He could trust. "This is Warlord Tekvar," he said into the communicator. "Ambassador Chen is free to depart at any time. However, I would like to extend an invitation to Captain Williams to join us for a diplomatic discussion." There was a pause. Then, "Thank you, Warlord. I appreciate the gesture. I'll be down in 10 minutes." The channel closed, leaving the communication center in stunned silence. Admiral Kekstoth looked like he was about to have a nervous breakdown, while the other officers exchanged worried glances. "My lord," the admiral said carefully, "are you certain this is wise? We know nothing about human military capabilities." "We know enough," Tekvar replied grimly. "We know that they built an empire in 3 months that rivals ours in size and surpasses it in technology. We know that they can make their ships invisible to our sensors and park them wherever they want. And we know that they're offering to talk instead of simply taking what they want." He turned to face his assembled officers, his bioluminescent patterns shifting to display the complex sequence that indicated deep contemplation mixed with grudging respect. "For 3,000 years, we have ruled through strength and fear. Our empire is built on the simple principle that the strong command and the weak obey. But what happens when we encounter something stronger than us?" The question hung in the air like a physical challenge. None of the officers had an answer. "We have 2 choices," Tekvar continued. "We can fight a war we cannot win against an enemy that doesn't want to be our enemy, or we can learn from them." 10 minutes later, the main hangar bay filled with a sound like distant thunder as a human shuttle materialized in the docking area. Like the larger ships, it seemed to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty, appearing solid one moment and translucent the next. When it finally stabilized, a boarding ramp extended and a single figure emerged. Captain Sarah Williams was smaller than Marcus, perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with dark skin and silver hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a uniform similar to Marcus's, but with additional insignia that marked her rank and authority. Like all humans, she moved with that peculiar fluid grace that suggested hidden strength beneath a deceptively fragile exterior. She was accompanied by 2 escorts, but they remained by the shuttle while she walked forward alone. The gesture was clearly deliberate, a demonstration of confidence that spoke louder than any show of force. Marcus stepped forward to greet her, and their embrace was warm and genuine. For a moment, they looked like old friends meeting after a long separation, rather than military officers conducting a diplomatic mission. "Sarah," Marcus said warmly, "thanks for coming." "Wouldn't dream of leaving you behind," she replied. Then she turned to face Tekvar, who had descended from the observation deck to meet them personally. "Warlord Tekvar," she said, executing a precise bow that managed to show respect without suggesting submission. "I'm Captain Williams, commander of the Cooperative's diplomatic escort. Thank you for agreeing to meet." Up close, she was even more disconcerting than Marcus had been. There was something about her eyes, a depth of experience and wisdom that seemed impossible in someone who looked so young. And like Marcus, she showed absolutely no fear in the presence of beings who could tear her apart without effort. "Captain," Tekvar replied carefully. Your ships are impressive. Thank you. We try to build our technology to reflect our values. Sophisticated, non-threatening, but absolutely reliable when we need them to be. She gestured toward the shuttle. I hope you don't mind, but I brought a small gift, a token of respect for our first official meeting. The shuttle's cargo bay opened, and her escorts began unloading several large containers. When they were opened, they revealed objects that made several of the Korthak officers gasp in amazement. The first container held weapons, but not crude tools of war. These were works of art, each one individually crafted with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. Bladed weapons with molecular-thin edges that could cut through anything, energy projectors that could precisely target a single molecule or level a city block, armor systems that could adapt to any threat in real time. The second container held technological marvels that defied easy categorization. Devices that could manipulate matter at the atomic level, computers that existed in quantum superposition, medical scanners that could diagnose and treat diseases that hadn't been invented yet. The third container held something even more valuable: knowledge. Data crystals containing the accumulated scientific and cultural achievements of dozens of species, freely shared and continuously updated. These are gifts, Captain Williams said simply. Not bribes, not tribute, not payment for anything, just gifts, given freely between potential friends. Admiral Kextoth stared at the advanced technology with undisguised hunger. Any one of these devices would revolutionize Korthak military capabilities. Collectively, they represented centuries of advancement. What do you want in return? Tekvar asked suspiciously. Nothing, Williams replied. That's not how friendship works. Friends help each other because they want to, not because they expect payment. And if we refuse your friendship, then we take our gifts and leave. Your choice, Warlord. We're not here to force anything on you. It was the same message Marcus had delivered, but from a different angle. The humans weren't threatening war or promising destruction. They were simply offering alternatives and letting the Korthak choose their own path. Marcus stepped forward, his expression serious. You asked me what would happen if you chose to keep being a predator. Let me show you. He walked to one of the communication consoles and began entering commands. The main display shifted, showing a real-time map of local space. The Korthak Empire appeared as a cluster of red dots, representing their controlled systems, but surrounding them like a rising tide was an ocean of blue. The cooperative, Marcus said simply. 47 systems as of this morning, but we're adding new members every day. Trade partners, defensive alliances, research collaborations, cultural exchanges. Every species that joins makes everyone else stronger. The map shifted again, showing projected growth patterns based on current expansion rates. Within a year, the blue ocean would completely surround the red cluster. Within 5 years, it would encompass hundreds of systems. You can stay in the red, Marcus continued. Keep ruling through fear. Keep taking what you want by force. Keep being predators in a galaxy that's learning to cooperate. But you'll be alone, isolated, and eventually, you'll be obsolete. He turned to face Tekvar directly. Or you can choose blue. Join the cooperative. Learn what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. And what would that involve? Tekvar asked. Captain Williams smiled. First, we'd need to address some human rights issues. The slave labor, the gladiatorial combat, the summary executions. We can't work with species that treat sentient beings as property. Those are our traditions, Admiral Kextoth protested. Our way of life. And they can change, Williams replied calmly. Humans used to practice slavery too. We gave it up when we realized that free people work harder, create more, and contribute better than slaves ever can. She gestured at the advanced technology they'd brought. Every one of these devices was created by someone who was free to pursue their passion, free to collaborate with others, free to share their discoveries. You can't force innovation, Warlord. You can only create conditions where it can flourish. Thekvar stared at the map, watching the projections play out in real time. The choice was stark and clear. Join the growing tide of cooperation or be left behind by it. What guarantee do we have that you won't simply conquer us once we're weakened by reforms? He asked. None, Marcus said honestly. Except our track record. Look at the other species in the cooperative. None of them have lost their cultural identity or their independence. They're all stronger now than they were before they joined us. Because strength isn't a zero-sum game, Williams added. When everyone gets stronger together, everyone benefits. That's what humans learned a long time ago. That's what we're trying to teach the galaxy. Thekvar was silent for a long moment, his bioluminescent patterns cycling through complex sequences as he processed everything he had learned. Around him, his officers waited for a decision that would shape the future of their entire species. Finally, he spoke. What would be required for the Korthak Empire to join your cooperative? The question sent shockwaves through the assembled court. Several officers looked like they were going to object, but a gesture from their warlord silenced them. Williams pulled out a small tablet and began scrolling through information. Standard procedure. We'd start with a cultural exchange program. Your people visit our worlds, our people visit yours. Learn about each other. Build understanding. Then we'd begin gradual reforms, starting with the most urgent humanitarian issues and working our way toward full integration. How long would the process take? As long as necessary. We don't force change, Warlord. We facilitate it. Some species join us fully within months. Others take decades to complete the transition. It depends on how ready they are to embrace new ways of thinking. Marcus stepped closer to Thekvar, his expression serious. There is one thing you need to understand. If you choose this path, there's no going back. Not because we won't let you, but because you won't want to. Once you experience what it's like to be part of something larger than yourself, once you see what cooperation can accomplish, you'll wonder how you ever lived any other way. Thekvar looked at the human who had walked into his throne room 3 days ago and casually shattered every assumption about strength and dominance and the natural order of things. The creature who had met his gaze without flinching and whispered 2 words that would change everything. Make me, he said quietly. Marcus smiled that same warm, knowing smile. Welcome to the cooperative and our warlord. Welcome to the future. As if in response to his words, the display screen shifted one final time, showing the Korthak systems changing from red to blue. The transformation was symbolic rather than real. The actual process would take months or years. But in that moment, watching his empire become part of something larger and more powerful than anything he had ever imagined, Thekvar finally understood what the human had meant. True strength wasn't about what you could force others to do. It was about what you could inspire them to become. And humans, it seemed, were very good at inspiration. The age of predators was ending. The age of cooperation had begun. And it had started with 2 simple words. Make me.